Well, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us. I am Chris Burrell. I'm the president of the Magic City Bar Association, and it brings me great pleasure to welcome you all here to the final installment of the Judicial Council's Diversity Matters CLE series. If you've attended any of these CLEs, then you know how great and awesome they've been. And today we expect nothing less. We have a great panel. And I noticed that they have a lot of Louisiana influences. So I'm really glad that they decided to do this, or that they agreed to do this panel before this weekend's Alabama LSU game. So let me just go ahead and throw that out there. But want to again welcome everyone to the Magic City Bar's Judicial Council CLE series. This is the finale, and again, we expect it to be awesome. Before we continue, I do want to take care of a few housekeeping matters. First and foremost, our CLEs are recorded, so we want to try to minimize any distractions to our panelists and the other attendees. We encourage everyone to listen to the CLE using the computer audio function. However, if for any reason you get disconnected, you can use the phone function, and those instructions are included with the instructions that you received when you register for the CLE. So just make sure that if you incur any feedback or disconnections due to a busy network or anything along those lines, that you use that audio function so that you can still hear the great information that's being presented. Secondly, we will have a live Q&A section. We do that at about 15 minutes near the end of the CLE. So please be sure to look at the chat functions if you want to ask questions, or if you want to see what questions are being asked prior, or if you want someone to expound on something. So just make sure that you're aware of that as well. Lastly, if you are seeking CLE credit, we ask that you, well, first and foremost, there is no partial credit. This is a CLE, this is a 2-hour CLE, so there's no partial credit. We ask that you participate in the polls that we'll be doing periodically. That way we can verify your attendance. And afterwards, we will, well, actually during the CLE, I'll put up a link to feedback. And also after the CLE, we will send out another email asking you for feedback. The purpose for that is because this is a virtual CLE, the state bar requires that you attest that you attended the CLE virtually before you can get credit. Now, of course, we know that there are more people outside of the state of Alabama as well who may be looking at this CLE. And so we will also send you a certificate of completion or a certificate of attendance so that you can submit that to your respective state bar for CLE credit. Moderating the discussion today is going to be Adrian Guy. Adrian's career began as a manager of affirmative action planning and college relations at Sony BMG Music in New York. After transitioning into broader roles in the company that will lead to improved employee relations and workforce planning, she later decided to relocate to New Orleans, Louisiana. There she would begin the process of revitalizing the alumni relations operations at Dillard University, her alma mater. There goes that Louisiana connection I was talking about earlier. While serving as the director of alumni relations, she went on to explore the other entrepreneurial interests, including and operating Cru de Brew Coffee House, which is located in the historic Lower Garden District in New Orleans until 2018. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree at Dillard University and her Juris Doctorate at the University of Virginia School of Law. She is a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and serves on the Next Gen board of GNO Incorporated. She's also currently the Assistant Vice President of the Development and Alumni Relations at Dillard University and is the President and CEO of A.G. Anderson LLC, a consulting firm that focuses on helping individuals and corporations advance their mission through leadership development, business strategy, and diversity and inclusion initiatives. Adrian, please begin today's CLE.
Thank you, Chris. We're delighted to have with us Professor Wayne Flint. Dr. Wayne Flint, Professor Emeritus in the Department of History at Auburn, author of 11 books, and one of the most recognized and honored scholars of Southern history, politics, and religion, has also published his memoir, Keeping the Faith: Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives, in which he writes about his experiences in the civil rights movement. The September 15, 1963 bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church was key in shaping Flint's views on the movement, confirming for him that those against civil rights were wrong and those who supported the movement were right. Flint notes that being 70 allowed him some freedom in writing. I'm retired. I don't give a hoot what anybody thinks about me. Nobody can get me fired because you can't fire someone from retirement. I love it. As a historian, Flint understands the sharp contrast between writing for academia and writing memoirs. With history, you're tied to your sources, tied to facts. A teacher believes Flint is always a teacher and can be a teacher in so many different ways through writing, through lectures, or through his or her memoir. It is Flint's ultimate wish to leave a legacy. Quote, I sort of like for somebody to believe somehow Alabama's a little bit better because I was a teacher and wrote about what I experienced and how I changed. We are also joined by former Mayor Mitch Landrieu. Mitch Landrieu is an American politician, lawyer, author, speaker, nonprofit leader, and CNN political commentator. He served as the 61st mayor of New Orleans between 2010 and 2018. When he took office, the city was still recovering from Hurricane Katrina and in the midst of the BP oil spill. Under Landrieu's leadership, New Orleans is widely recognized as one of the nation's great comeback stories. In 2015, Landrieu was named Public Official of the Year by Governing, and in 2016 was voted America's top turnaround mayor in a Politico survey of mayors. He also served as president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Landrieu gained national prominence for his powerful decision to take down 4 Confederate monuments in New Orleans, which also earned him the prestigious John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. In his best-selling book, In the Shadow of Statues, A White Southerner Confronts History, Landrieu recounts his personal journey confronting the issue of race and institutional racism that still plagues America. In 2018, he launched E Pluribus Unum, an initiative in the South created to fulfill America's promise of justice and opportunity for all by breaking down the barriers that divide us by race and class. E Pluribus Unum is building a series of programs and initiatives to cultivate courageous leaders who are committed to realizing an inclusive vision for a new South, championing transformative policies to reverse the enduring harms of America's Jim Crow era past for those who continue to experience them today, and change narratives that perpetuate systemic and interpersonal racism in order to shift people's attitudes and behaviors. Prior to serving as mayor, Landrieu served 2 terms as lieutenant governor and 16 years in the state legislature. He and his wife, Cheryl, live in New Orleans, where they raised their 5 children. Thank you to our presenters for joining us today. And at this time, we'll get started with a presentation by Dr. Flint.
Thank you so much. And it's great to be on the program, especially with Ms. Landrieu, a person I've always admired and thought was one of our really important political voices in the South. I suppose that to begin with, we need to understand that historians try to be objective about what they're writing about, but absolute objectivity is almost impossible because we're all influenced by the experiences we've had. So following that logic and my writing, which is basically focused on 20th century American politics, especially the South, I need to have a confessional or as African-American and Caucasian evangelicals put it, explain my conversion experience. Uh, my folks are from the hill country, the mountain country of Northeast Alabama. My grandfather was a sharecropper who could not read and write until he was an adult. He never owned land. He always farmed someone else's land. My grandmother was one of 18 children. My father, one of 8 children. My dad worked as a steel worker in Birmingham as a salesman, never graduated high school. And so that story is really important to what I'm going to say in 2 ways. One way is there was once a politics of hill country Southern life, which was progressive, liberal, radical, and populist. There were very few Blacks in the area where my grandfather lived, in the shadow of the Coosa River. There were very few in Northeast Alabama, period. And that area north of Birmingham, from the city of Birmingham north to the Tennessee Valley, was one of the most liberal areas of America until Brown v. Board. I know that's hard for anyone to believe, but it's true. And I'll follow up on that in just a minute with Alabama's amazing political heritage. But I grew up in a traditional home. One reason John Lewis was a great hero of mine is because we were born the same year. We both became Baptist ministers as teenagers. We both preached. We both got in trouble by what we preached. When I read the Bible, I could not reconcile that as a 14, 15-year-old kid with racism. And so I slipped the bonds of my heritage really early in life as a teenage Baptist ministerial student headed to Howard College, Samford University now, in order to preach the gospel. I took very seriously Matthew 25 about justice for the poor, the oppressed, for orphans, widows, welcoming strangers in the land, visiting people who were in trouble. And I discovered that my Baptist sisters and brethren didn't take it nearly as seriously as I did. And as a consequence of that, left the ministry because I didn't believe they really believed the Bible, which they proclaimed. Still don't, as a matter of fact. They just sort of erase that part of the Bible altogether. So by the age of 20, I was already moving beyond the world that I had been born into. Most people did not agree with my viewpoint in the family. I was the first Republican in the history of the family because they were all conservative Democrats. And now they're all Republicans and I'm a liberal Democrat. So as I say, our personal stories are really important to the way in which we understand history. By the time I returned to Birmingham to teach at my alma mater in 1965, we had gone through Brown v. Board of Education, the Public Accommodations Act of 1964, and most importantly, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I not only taught Southern history, Alabama history at Samford, I also began a tutoring program in 1966 at Rosedale High School, which is a Black enclave in Homewood, Alabama. The high school was all Black. It was within the shadow of Shades Valley High School, considered the finest high school in Alabama at the time in Mountain Brook. I've been to Shades Valley and I'd seen that school. I've been to Rosedale 3 miles away and seen that school. They had one microscope in the high school, one microscope. They did not teach chemistry. They did not teach physics. They had no foreign language programs. And when I took my Samford students in the Young Democrats club that I had started into the school, they were astounded at the difference between our campus and 5 miles away in downtown Homewood in Rosedale. This high school that had virtually no resources at all. Wonderful teachers trying the best they could. Most of the families, wonderful families, most of them were steel workers at US Steel or at Sloss. They were members of unions, they were politically active, but they couldn't vote. Poll taxes, reading clauses in the Constitution, literacy tests, had to pay the poll tax in Alabama under the 1901 Constitution every year, whether or not there was an election. The estimate is that by 1940, 1 million of Alabama's 3.8 million people were disenfranchised by the poll tax, just the poll tax. And then all of a sudden in 1965, bam, poll tax is gone. Literacy tests are gone, and the world is completely new politically in Alabama. So it occurred to us that we ought to organize a voter registration drive in the Rosedale community. So we went door to door, knocking on doors. And for many of the people, especially the older people who had no cars, we took them to register to vote for the first time in their lives. Mitch will remember this in Louisiana because it was just like in Alabama, that the 1968 presidential election was the first time in the living memory of most African Americans in Louisiana, Alabama, and other southern states when they had a chance to fully participate in the American dream of democracy. So my experience was a woman in her 90s, registered to vote for the first time. I took her to register, then I knocked on her door and I said, "Do you need a ride to the polls?" This was 1968. She said, "I do need a ride to the polls. Can you come get me?" So I did. She was dressed in the finest church meeting dress she had. She had on high heels in order to stand in line. She had on a hat that was a rival to my wife's collection of vintage 1920s and 30s women's hats. She was dressed to the nines and she had her purse and she was ready to go. So we go to Homewood, to the precinct where she was registered, also the precinct where I voted. And we stood in line and she got to the front of the line. And the clerk said, "Assign your name here on the book." And she said, "I don't know how to write." And the woman said, "Well, why do you think you can vote if you don't know how to write?" And the woman just was stunned because she knew that the Voting Rights Act had given her the right to act. So I walk in front of her and I say, "Ma'am, the Voting Rights Act has struck down literacy requirements. And the fact that she cannot write her name is not her fault. It's because Alabama never provided the money to educate African Americans, much less African American women. And so she has a right under the Voting Rights Act to vote." And by now, this conversation is spilling over to a long line of white people behind me. And she said, "I want both of you to get out of line. And if you don't, I'm going to call the Homewood police and have you arrested." Classic approach to intimidating voters. And in 1968, that happened all across the South. So I said, "Ma'am, the Voting Rights Act has struck down the literacy test, and this woman is going to vote." And she said, "I will call the Homewood police and have you arrested." And I said, "And I will call the federal registrars that have flooded Alabama and Mississippi as a result of the Voting Rights Act and its enforcement. And I can assure you, I will be out of the Homewood jail before you're out of a federal penitentiary," which really got her attention. And she said, "Well, I'll let her vote, but I want you to know I don't like this." So I said, "Ma'am, I really don't care what you like as long as this woman is allowed to vote." So she and I walk into the voting booth, we close the curtain. I read the names on the list, and it's no surprise that she voted for Lyndon Johnson, a straight Democratic ticket, although there were a lot of racists on that ticket at the time. And we went out and we went home, and that was probably one of the proudest days of her life and mine as well. I say all that to let you know that my conversion process was as much connected to that day in that Homewood precinct as it was to reading history. And so if you read the chapter on race in Alabama History of a Deep South State, or if you read the chapter on race in Alabama in the 20th century, you may sort of read that in the context of what I experienced and not just the research I did in this process. But the research is really important. And what I tried to do was to move outside the realm of my own personal identity in terms of politics and religion to the larger terrain of the state of Alabama and the story of race in this state. And it's really important to understand that 46% of Alabamians in 1860 were African Americans, and virtually all of them slaves. Nearly one half of all the people who lived in the state were African American. Secondly, it's really important to understand that in terms of rights, there were virtually no rights. I thought you might be interested in what one of my Baptist predecessors wrote. Basil Manley was probably the most influential Baptist of his era, classically educated and brought classical education to the University of Alabama when he became president of the University of Alabama. And while he was president of the University of Alabama, he wrote that he was compelled to rebuke a slave belonging to a professor at the University of Alabama who was bringing slave girls to men for their use in great numbers nightly at the University of Alabama. Can you believe that? I mean, can you believe that there is within the journal of a Baptist president of a university, the University of Alabama, who would talk about sexual slavery by undergraduate male students at the University of Alabama? Brief segue. If you look at where the universities were in 1860 in Alabama, Tuscaloosa on the northern edge of Perry County in the Black Belt, Auburn on the northern edge of Macon County, and it was in Macon County at the time. It was not renamed for Robert E. Lee until after the Civil War. So we were in a Black Belt county. Alabama was on the edge of a Black Belt county. My alma mater, Samford University, was in Perry County, at the time one of the 10 wealthiest counties in America. By 2020, one of the 10 poorest counties in America. Judson College, the Baptist Women's College, was in the same town, Marion. Birmingham Southern was in Greensboro, right down the road, 20 miles. That's Birmingham Southern. So if you look, and the Tennessee Valley, where a number of colleges were located, was also in a slave district right down the Tennessee Valley. So to put a modern face on this story, universities in Alabama in 1860 were for planters' children, mainly men, almost exclusively men. The endowments that were created by these universities over nearly 200 years were endowments that resulted, at least initially, almost exclusively from planters, and then from the sons and daughters of planters who created modern Birmingham and modern Huntsville and other metropolitan centers in the state of Alabama. University of Alabama's endowment is now $1.7 billion. My alma mater's is $250 million. Auburn's is $1.4 billion. Imagine the difference it would make if we took 0.01% of the endowments of all those universities and devoted them to the Alabama Black Belt and new programs in the Alabama Black Belt. For instance, every law student at the University of Alabama has to spend one semester doing public defender work in a Black Belt county. Every pharmacy student at Auburn has to spend one semester doing public health work in a Black Belt county. Divide the state at Montgomery, and Alabama gets everything from Montgomery to Demopolis. Auburn gets everything from Montgomery to Eufaula. And every single Auburn student, black or white, Asian or whatever, spends one semester learning what the world is like from the standpoint of people whose work created the universities which they now attend. You know what that would amount to? $26 million. $26 million. That's called compensatory justice. And until we get to the point where we move beyond symbols, as much as I think we ought to deal with statues, Confederate statues, that's an easy way out. Like, for instance, a conference call I had with the University of Alabama. They were considering changing the names of 4 buildings at the University of Alabama. And we had a 30-minute conversation about changing the names of the 4 buildings. And then I suggested, I'm wasting my time here. What you need to do is take 0.01% of your endowment and do something in the Black Belt. I don't really care whether you change the names of the buildings if you just do something in the Black Belt. So what I'm saying is here, watch out for symbols, because an awful lot of people will gladly agree to a symbolic change who have no intent whatsoever to make a compensatory justice change. And so don't let them off. I'm 80, I'm going to be dead in a few months or a few years. But those of you who are still alive, don't let them off that easily. Now, let's go back in time to 1860. I'm watching my time, so I'm not going to take too long here. But if you go back in 1860, when 46% of Alabama's population is African American, and then you began to look at what happened after that. Briefly, Reconstruction, and African Americans had the right to vote and were elected to public office, including the state legislature, including the United States Congress. And they served as honorably and as well as any white who had ever held any of those offices. Then, of course, the federal government deserts them in the Compromise of 1876. And all of a sudden, African Americans are thrown back into a system where you have a legal substitute for slavery. Peonage, lack of education, lack of funding, inequitable school funding when there were any schools at all. And what you had was a sort of neo kind of slavery, a new kind of slavery that is essentially based on economics and lack of education. The 1901 Constitution, which still misgoverns the state of Alabama, Mitch, you can at least take pride in Louisiana in one thing: your Constitution is better than ours. I want to read you a letter that I received from a wonderful woman living in South Alabama. Her father was a delegate to the 1901 Disfranchisement Convention. And he wrote her September 27th, 1902, "Dear Stella, I'm sending you this pen because I thought you would be more apt to keep it than any of the other grandchildren. I wrote my name to our new Constitution in September with it, and 50 or so many years, or as many years as we live under this Constitution, the signers' names will be before the people. If it shall prove to be a wise thing, we will be honored for making it, and if it should not prove to be a good one, it can be amended to suit the people. This will never be forgotten. We have virtually disfranchised the Negro. We have reduced the taxes and largely increased the school fund. So keep this pen as a souvenir, remembering your grandpa wrote his name as a member of the convention that drew up this Constitution." All I have to add to that is, if you compare any quality of life issue in Alabama compared to other states, what you will find is that we trail virtually every other state in quality of life, in early childhood education, in the ultimate product of health and human services, in terms of poverty, in terms of workforce management. In short, the price we have paid for this Constitution is the price of becoming a modern state. And remember that this Constitution, though many times amended, is still governing law of the state of Alabama. In my book, Alabama in the 20th Century, I have a chapter called The Flowering of Alabama Liberalism, 1940s, 1950s. And I know you're all smirking and grinning because you're going to say there has never been a flowering of Alabama liberalism, and you would be wrong. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, there was a remarkable movement in Alabama to the degree that Blacks could vote. It was biracial. Mostly it was just working class whites in the North Alabama Hill Country and in cities. You have to remember that in this period, Alabama was one of the most industrialized of the southern states. It was, as a result of that, the most unionized of all the southern states, mainly the United Steelworkers, the United Mine Workers, but other unions in Mobile, in the waterfront district. It was also a state that had a long populist tradition going back to the late 19th century. It was a state in which economic divisions between North Alabama and the planter world of South Alabama were pronounced and highly political. And one of the most important things about the 1901 Constitution was its class orientation. By that I mean, in order to vote, you had to pay a poll tax of $1.50 a year for every year, regardless of whether there was an election during that year. So you could go a cycle of 4 years, never vote, and still have to pay a property tax. In addition to that, there was a literacy test. You had to be able to read and write, which was what was being enforced in 1965 at the Homewood precinct, or 68 at the precinct where I took my Black friend. In addition to that, you had to own at least 40 acres of property and without debt. And so roughly a third of the possible voters in Alabama were disfranchised by the terms of the 1901 Constitution until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In spite of that, in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, we had arguably the most liberal political culture in the South. Not only do you have Bibb Graves, though a member of the Ku Klux Klan, an advocate of, he joined the Klan despite tremendous education and background, because Bibb Graves was a political opportunist who ran for election in 1926 when the Klan was as large in Alabama as it's ever been. So he became a member of the Klan as a political opportunistic move in order to try to help people, which he did, Black and white, in the late 1920s. In the 1930s, you have a whole series of progressive governors. In the 1940s, you have Jim Folsom, who, despite his personal eccentricities, 6 feet 8 inches of political eccentricity, was a phenomenally successful governor in terms of reaching out to African Americans and to working class whites. The organized labor movement was stronger in Alabama than any other southern state, greatly helped in this regard. Our congressional delegation, Lister Hill, John Sparkman, Carl Elliott, a whole series of congressmen, Albert Raines included, in North Alabama, who represented the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And I came across a really interesting interview in the New Republic magazine. This was 1955, and the editor of New Republic magazine said, "Why is it that Alabama in the last generation has produced so many more liberally minded public men than any neighboring southern state?" Well, I've just given you the answer to that. Urbanization in Birmingham, the Birmingham district, the labor movement, North Alabama populism, and the farm tradition. But the point is, we had a liberal tradition within white Alabama culture right up until the time of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So what happened? How did that tradition die, or at least become an extreme minority tradition in Alabama? It's very simple. The politics of economic justice was replaced by the politics of racial equality. As painful as it is for me to admit that, Alabama and other southern states have not been able to perpetuate a world in which economic justice and racial equality could be merged. And every time the argument has been primarily in favor of racial justice, we lose white working class voters. And every time economic justice is the predominant issue, the whites drift back into a reform movement. Let me just put a face on this. Arguably the most powerful politician in Alabama history, and certainly since the 1940s, was George Corley Wallace. Planter County, Barber County, but his family was not a planter family. They were a relatively hard-working middle-class family, lower middle-class family. And of course, that was augmented by his service in World War II. And he emerges as a kind of populistic Jim Folsom leader right up until the time race became the primary issue in Alabama politics. When he serves 4 terms as governor, 2, then his wife, then 2 more after that. So 2 in the 60s, 2 in the 70s. But what we sometimes forget is George Wallace had ambitions much larger than Alabama. And in 1968 and again in 1972, he entered presidential primaries. And if you take the map of the United States politically and you do an overlay of 2016 and 2020, where Wallace was extremely successful in the presidential primaries of 1968 and 1972, you probably already figured out where I'm going. Wisconsin, Michigan, the eastern shore of near Baltimore in Maryland, that is the place where Wallace actually beat the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, was in the same counties that voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. Or to put it another way, we need to nationalize the debate about Black Lives Matter, because this is essentially, as African Americans have pointed out in the last year, not an argument about the South and the North. It is an argument about economic insecurity, about cultural marginalization, about the separation of upper middle class, well-educated white people and Black people from uneducated African American and Hispanic and white people. This is as much an argument about class as it is about race. It is as much an argument about culture as it is about race. One other thing that I want to emphasize, if you're an African-American historian, or if you're just an African-American citizen, from the time that you were just a little kid bouncing up on your grandfather's knee, you've heard about the Great Migration. And the Great Migration is the story of the movement outward from the South of African Americans. When that first began in 1917, it was greeted with such jubilation among white people. Remember this, it's only now 16 years after the 1901 Alabama Constitution. And white people were so glad to see all these black people leaving that they would sometimes escort them to the train and wave at them as they left. That is, right up until the time that it dawned on them they were losing a cheap labor force of tenant farmers like my grandfather. And all of a sudden, instead of escorting African Americans from the Black Belt of Alabama to the train, the deputy sheriffs and the sheriffs were going to the train to pull African Americans off the train, to physically restrain them from leaving places like Barber County and Perry County and Sumter County and Greene County, because they didn't want to lose their cheap labor force. And so all of a sudden, this great migration is the dream of young, ambitious, independent, and to some degree, unruly Blacks who were anxious to escape apartheid. And it was the place where older, more supplicant, more subservient African Americans remained, because they were afraid of the challenges of a place like Washington, D.C., or Chicago, or Detroit, or other northern sites. I actually did some work on Chicago, because Chicago was a major point of destination for African Americans leaving the central Alabama Black Belt. The center of that was Montgomery, so they're moving to Montgomery on the train. Sometimes they'd go to Birmingham to learn industrial skills in order to go to the Midwest and work, first in West Virginia and the coal mines, where they had experience in some cases and where their kids could still go to public schools. Then from West Virginia, they go north to Chicago. The first United States senator who was an African-American female, her people were from Alabama. She lived in Chicago when she was elected United States Senator from Illinois, but her people were from Alabama. The first African-American Republican elected from Chicago was from Alabama. The Democrat who beat that Republican in the 1930s, his parents were from Alabama. The most popular singer of American popular culture in the era that I grew up was Nat King Cole. His father was a Baptist preacher from Montgomery, Alabama, took him to Chicago. The first female Black astronaut was from Chicago. Her parents were from Alabama. The point I'm trying to make here is that if you very carefully look at African-American leaders in Chicago, you will see that they are from the First Montgomery Baptist Church, which virtually left en masse to go to Chicago and recreated itself, partly under the leadership of Nat King Cole's father. And from that network came all these remarkable people. But let me end with a story that I think is even more important than that, because at the heart of every Alabamian is the notion that you may be secondary in education, in culture, and everything else, but you are not second in sport. Unless, of course, you export all of your greatest athletes to some other place. Think Jesse Owen, perhaps the greatest track star in American history. Certainly most American historians of the sport of track and field consider Jesse Owens the greatest sprinter of all time. Tennessee Valley. Hank Aaron, the home run king. Willie Mays. Willie Stargell. The list goes on and on. The greatest boxer of all time, Joe Louis, from 40 miles from above where I live in Auburn, up in Tallapoosa County. My point is that we say we really believe in trying to keep our best and brightest, our most famous. Well, then why have we spent 200 years in Alabama driving them out to some other place? Our prophets, think John Lewis, one of the most venerated visionaries of the future of America that this country has ever produced. And for heaven's sakes, a Baptist preacher on top of that. And at least we didn't send him any further than Atlanta, but that's too far for me. I want to keep him here in Alabama. So what I'm saying is, until Alabama comes to terms with the fact that it cannot spare to lose one single person of the quality of the ones that I have described in the past 45 minutes, until we cross that intersection in this state's history, we will always be what we are now, sucking hard as we can to be in 49th place ahead of Mississippi. If that's where we want to be, all we have to do is look at 200 years of Alabama history and say, let's just keep doing things the same way we're doing them. And we will be exactly the same place where we are 200 years from now that we are in 2020. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Flint. Just because we have another moment before we start with our former mayor here, I'd like to just point out and maybe really just leave for a question in people's minds in reference to a couple of things you noted. On that last point, you know, I have to ask the question, why are minorities not second in sport, but first in sports? And why are we so okay with that? And the system lends itself to that. I would ask the question, is it because number one, the rules are very public? Is it because number two, the competition itself is very public? And is it because number three, should the system seek to cheat these individuals, that too is also made public? So I'm just throwing that out there as something that I think is just a question I always keep in the back of our minds as you reference that. And I think that I would be not doing my due diligence in representation if I didn't also respond to your question or your point, which was very good, and I think often overlooked, about the importance of, you know, putting symbolistic change in an appropriate place versus compensatory change. And I think that, you know, your suggestions are very spot on. But as a product of a historically Black college and university, and being a member of the staff of an HBCU as well, I would ask the question, what would happen or what would change in the advancement of the education of Blacks if institutions which profited from slavery and have multi-billion-dollar endowments as a result would also commit a percentage of that profit to the institutions that educate the communities who built them? In other words, what if a Harvard, what if a University of Virginia committed a percentage of its endowment to a Dillard University or a Clark Atlanta University? You know, that's a good question that I just want to put out there for people to consider based on the points, very appropriate points you've made. Thank you so much, Dr. Flint, for all that you've given us to think about and to consider. Before you come, Mayor Landrieu, I think I'm speaking something into existence here. I'd like to make sure our audience is aware that you can feel free to populate questions into the Q&A queue, even though we've not gotten to that portion of the agenda yet. So don't feel like you have to wait. Feel free to populate your questions into the Q&A box, and we will get to them following Mayor Landrieu's presentation. All right, Mayor Landrieu, you have the floor.
Ms. Guy, thank you so much. It's great to see you again. And I look forward to spending time with you with our cousins over in Alabama, although I'm hailing from Louisiana right now. And I know the Alabama LSU games this weekend. I'm going to let y'all sit in the fact that y'all think y'all are better athletically than LSU, but we'll deal with that later. Let me also say that I'm thrilled to be with the Magic City Bar Association and, of course, Judge Tracy Todd and Judge Katrina Reese. Ross, I thank you so much. Dr. Flint, that was really good. You're a little bit senior to me, not that much more. And I notice in your bio that you're feeling really free to say what you want because nobody can fire you. That's a beautiful place to be. And I love being with people that are free, that are smart, and that have a great heart. And what everybody just heard was one of the best recitations about our history. I know it was a little bit Alabama centric, but Dr. Flint will tell you that that same history, with a couple of the facts change, reflect the history of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, all of the lower southern states and some of the higher southern states, Texas and Florida, although they act like they're not southern, but they are. And the most poignant point of the many, Dr. Flint, that you made was that although we're talking about this in the South, because we have a special obligation, because so much of it started here, that this is not a Southern phenomenon. This is an issue that has been coursing through in a very corrosive way the veins of this country since our inception. And so let me just talk a little bit about my journey and my perspective that actually is a little bit familiar to some of the things that Dr. Flint said. I can't really talk about this without you guys knowing who I am and where I come from. And so my story is interesting, I think. I'm one of 9 kids. My mom and dad, both Moon and Vernon Landry, still alive today. My dad's 90, my mom's 88. They live right down the street. Same house that I was born in, where my mother has lived 80 of the 88 years that she's been alive, right across the street. I won't go too far back, but in 1960, my dad was 29 years old. He was a newly elected legislature. Dr. Flint will remember that those were the great years when George Wallace and in our case, Jimmy Davis were standing in the schoolhouse doors, both Southern governors, both demanding segregation forever. Those days, those quote unquote great days that people want to go back to. My mother was home with 4 babies under 5 years old, and I was waiting to be born. In one of the early days when my dad was in the legislature, having just gotten elected, having not known anybody, Governor Davis proposed a segregation forever legislation. And my father was one of 2 people, all of whom were white, in the legislature at that time, that voted against it. And while my mother was home pregnant with me, that night, my father got into an elevator, and into the elevator behind him came Leander Perez, who you guys may not know, but in Louisiana, he was the penultimate racist, along with a congressman whose name was Louis Rainick. And they threatened his life. And they said, you're not going to make it. Well, the short story is that he made it, and he went on to have 4 more children with my mother. After that, become a councilman at large. In 1966, they removed the Confederate flag from the council chamber in New Orleans. He went on to serve as mayor for 8 years, and then he became the secretary of HUD for President Carter's cabinet. During that entire time that he served in office, our lives have, been in the space of having your lives threatened, really working hard to make sure that African Americans were given the opportunities that were necessary and required in city government. And in that space, when I was 13 years old, was the first time I had my life threatened by a woman who was a white supremacist because of the work that my father had done. So that's kind of the space that we grew up in. Our neighborhood that we lived in was one of the first integrated neighborhoods in the city. As a kid, it never occurred to me until later in my life, when I went to a predominantly white high school, that my white friends thought I lived in a black neighborhood. I was like, well, I don't think I live in a black neighborhood. And I said, well, how would you define that? And they said, well, they got 2 black people that live in your neighborhood. This was early. And I said, I don't understand what it is that you're saying. I said, I live in the best neighborhood in the city. And as that neighborhood became more integrated, and Dr. Flint will confirm this, and it happened, and all of you know it, everybody started running to the suburbs. We never went anywhere. We stayed where we were. My first recollection of being impacted, I write this in the book that I wrote, was in second grade when I got to school. This little girl who I liked, it's my first girlfriend, I like to say, wasn't there. And there was a new young boy there, a kid of color whose name was Clarence Gilry. And the girl who left happened to be the daughter of the guy that had been the catcher on my father's baseball team. Now, this baseball team was a team of great renown in the city of New Orleans because it was a high school team that actually went to the World Series. And my father was a pretty good pitcher. This was his catcher. And anybody knows in sports, they're like the best of friends all the time. But when that school got integrated, this guy pulled his kids out of it and began folks leaving. And that was the first time, because I went home and I said, Margaret left, why'd she leave? And my father, who lost his friendship with this guy over this issue, began to explain to me and educating me and us about the complicated and difficult issue of race and why it was so hard for white people to just get their heads around the fact that the world was changing and that we were living in an unjust society. In any event, I grew up, went to law school at Loyola. And, it's funny, Dr. Flint, you talk about the inconsistency of the way some people say they praise and the way they act. I've always kind of been drawn to, I was raised as a Catholic, been drawn to the New Testament side. And, when you have people talk in a certain way and act in a certain way, if you have open eyes and you have an open heart, you see such an incredible inconsistency, especially around the issue of race. And it is irreconcilable when you point it out to them. And when you just think about what the good book says, I know you talked about Matthew 25, but when they confronted Jesus and they were trying to trick him and said, what is the greatest commandment? And he said, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. And you point that out to some of our more conservative Christian friends on the role that we've played in the way we work. It's an irreconcilable thing, but it shouldn't be, because if you do it right, it ought to be easy. Suffice it to say that slavery obviously was this nation's original sin. Racism continues to be the Achilles heel that will cripple this nation and hobble this nation until we deal with it. Now, my observation as a human being is that it's just really hard for us to deal with. We want to go around it. We want to go over it. We want to go under it, but we never really want to go through it. We certainly don't want to reconcile with our past. We would have a tendency to ignore our past. We have a tendency to create narratives that don't tell the whole story. We make up things. We don't acknowledge the institutional biases that exist. And that's a real problem. It manifests itself in a lot of different ways. I think Dr. Flint is right. This is not just an issue of race, although it is very much one of race. It is as much an issue of class. It is definitely an issue of culture. And they're all busting up against each other. But this isn't the first time that has happened. This has been happening since before this country actually became the United States of America over the last 400 years, and it has continued apace. Now, interestingly enough, Dr. Ibrahim X. Kendi has a certain theory of how we've moved forward. President Obama has spoken about it a little bit, the kind of two different versions. One is that we've made some progress racially and then we've retrenched. And then we've made more progress, then we've retrenched, then we've made more progress. And that's best enunciated in the very familiar statement about the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. For all of us that have been out here, we go, well, yeah, but it doesn't bend on its own. Somebody's got to do the bending. And that's one theory. The other theory is that, no, that's not the way it worked. Actually, what happened was evil and good have been running side by side, since the beginning of time. And at different points in time, one does better than the other, but it's all still there. That's certainly what it looks like today. But I think that we can argue about that. When I served in the legislature for 16 years. Strangely enough, if you can just believe this, David Duke gets elected to the state legislature in 1991 or 92 when I'm there. And, he starts drawing big crowds. A lot of white people going to David Duke's rallies, and you're scratching your head saying, what in the world? This guy's talking in code. He was a precursor to what Donald Trump was going to be able to do. But all of us that live in the South know what dog whistles are. Trump has taken it to new heights. It's not even a dog whistle. It's a train coming down the track, and it's overt. And it's the first time in the history of the country, notwithstanding the folks that Dr. Flint told us about, George Wallace being one of them, Jimmy Davis being another. It's the first time that those kinds of things have been uttered out of the most powerful office in the world. Previous to that, you could almost not dismiss, but you could say, man, look, that's just a couple of governors down south. That's never going to make its way to the top office, but it has. And that is I guess, an indication that this illness of racism that we have will never be extricated if we don't confront it in a really serious and thoughtful way. Now, when I was mayor of the city, I took over after Katrina, Rita, Ike, Gustav, national recession, BP oil spill. I mean, we were in a mell of a hess, as we like to say, in the city, and we began to rebuild the city. We didn't want to put it back the way it was. We wanted to put it back the way it should have been had we gotten it right the first time. And what that meant was making sure that we built the city back for everybody. But it's hard to completely reconstruct the city from ground zero. And as you can tell right now with COVID, everybody just wants to go back to normal as fast as they can. The problem is there is no normal anymore. You're not going back to the way it was before. And COVID, just like Katrina, and any other catastrophic event that will occur in your life, actually peels back the truth. And the truth can be beautiful. It can be rich. It can be deep, but it also can be really ugly, and it can be really divisive. And oftentimes you see both of those things at the same time. A disaster, whether it be a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, or a pandemic, actually puts a mirror up to how the society really is. And if you look away from it, which is what we do most of the time in the country, you skate through it, you get back to where you were, and you move on. But if you take a minute and actually look at it, sometimes you can't look away, and you shouldn't look away. And so COVID, nobody that lives in the South is surprised that African Americans are being disproportionately impacted by the virus. Now, the virus hits everybody, like a hurricane hits everybody, but who it impacts and how it impacts people is different, because the virus or the storm finds people where they are. And if they happen to be in a bad place, especially because of historic inequality or system design or institutional bias, it's going to be that much harder. And so as you look at it and you talk to white people about institutional bias and change, they sometimes just look away from it. And so this is one of the issues that we're going to have to deal with in the country. When I left the mayor's office, I wanted to really try to explore in more detail a lot of the work that Dr. Flint and so many other people have done across the South, is to really start talking to people about whether we could find common ground. Because as a guy that grew up in politics and attended Loyola Law School in there, and I practiced law for 16 years, you start to really think about why things keep happening the way they do. And is it just a matter of people making bad decisions, or is it about systems design? What the heck is it? On top of that, it's very clear to anybody that knows our political history, particularly in the South, although it has been with us a very, very long time, it really got put on steroids in 1970 when Richard Nixon intentionally created the Southern strategy, which was designed to keep poor whites and poor blacks separate and distinct. That liberal bent that was in the South way back when, that went away, not by accident, it went away by design. And the idea has always been that if you could keep people apart based on race, they may never find their common purpose in finding the common good and what is necessary. And so I've been traveling across the South with a team of folks for the last year or so. We did over 800 interviews. We've been to Alabama, been to Birmingham. Mayor Woodfin is a good friend. When you think about, Addie Mae Collins and Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robinson and Carol McNair, you think about what Dylan Roof did and Mother Emanuel. These aren't these aren't new stories. They continue on today. And then when George Floyd was killed, and it was impossible for people to look away, all of a sudden people are starting to dig a little bit deeper, although we're being pulled back in a different direction and starting to think about how we're going to get to where we need to go. And Dr. Flint, I know you didn't intend to make me cry, but I love my country, but I got to tell you, I really weep as a Southerner when I think of what we lost in the Great Migration. Isabella Wilkerson wrote the book Warmth of Other Suns. If you have not read it, please treat yourself to it. It's the best exposition. Dr. Flint did a good job of giving you a piece of it, but if you want to know about what the real totality of the loss has been, that book lays it out better than anybody has. And her latest book on caste solidifies the point that Dr. Flint made, that this is not just about race. It's about something other than that as well. Essentially, though, it is about the same thing, which is that some people think that because of race, they are better than others. They are superior to others, which, of course, is the most antithetical American thought that there is. Essentially, the founding fathers, as imperfect as they were, as hypocritical as they were, having written that all men were created equal while some of them were owning slaves, that aspiration and that idea that all men, all people are created equal, that we all come to the table of democracy as equals, is a profound idea. It is an aspiration. We have never achieved it. But there's a reason why we haven't achieved it. And of course, in our travels across the South, it's not that we came up with any incredible insights that people hadn't thought about before, but it's pretty clear to me after interviewing 800 people, white and black, rich and poor, folks that are working in the rural areas and folks that are working in the cities, that this nation is divided by design. It's this way because we designed it this way. And I don't think there's any question about that. I think that's a provable fact. And that if we're going to change it, if we're going to create access and opportunity, we're going to have to redesign it. I don't disagree with Dr. Flint about be careful about being hoodwinked just by taking symbols down. But taking them down is really important. When we took down those Confederate monuments, it opened up people's minds to actually why they were there, who put them there, what their intention was. They don't need to be there. And every Confederate monument on public space needs to be removed in the South. And the names of the bases need to be changed. It is not fair. It's not just. It's not equitable. It doesn't make any sense. And it's an insult to the people of America, especially African Americans, to be forced to walk in a courthouse, to walk in a Capitol, to walk on a public space, to go in an Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine base where the name of someone is being adored, whose mission it was to destroy the United States of America for the sake of preserving slavery. That's just wrong, and that should be changed. However, if that's all that we do, and all we do is change the symbol, and we don't change the reason why they were put up or the institutions that allowed them to stand, then we will not have done nearly enough. And of course, just taking down symbols doesn't fix things, but the reparation of the damage that was done, I believe, is critically important. Now, Dr. Flint gave you a good idea. I love that idea. I actually have talked to people about it before and thinks it makes great sense. What if every major institution of higher learning peeled off a percentage of their endowment and directed it to repairing the damage that had been done? Either by investing it, as you say, in the Black Belt or investing it in other HBCUs. That is one really wonderful idea. It falls into the category of fixing what you broke. And I think that idea makes a tremendous amount of sense. What that looks like, what form it takes, how much more has to be done is, I think, ripe for intense discussion. But systemic change and systemic reform, whether it be in the financial system, whether it be with the Federal Reserve, whether it be in corporate America, whether it be with restructuring the entire criminal justice system and the economic system, all of those things, not the least of which has to do with voting rights and gerrymandering, are critical things that are going to hopefully put us in a position to lean forward and to build a more stable and just and fair America. I can tell you this, that when you think about I think 6 million people you can correct me here, Dr. Flynn, if I'm wrong, that left the South, that were forced to leave because it was so oppressive. When you think about the incredible intellectual capital, the raw material, the raw talent that left and continues to leave, it just makes you just want to hang your head and cry. And if you can just envision for a minute what a new South would look like if we got it right, meaning if we fixed what was broken and we did it the way it should have been done. And those of us that love each other and care for each other, irrespective of race, found a community of purpose and common ground, how incredible the southern part of America would be. And then consequently, the United States of America can be, because look, I'm a Southerner through and through, just like you guys. You know, I know we all have a little bit of chip on our shoulder because our friends from the Northeast and the West think they're smarter than us. They don't think we know how to read or write and have shoes. I beg to differ with them. And I do think since it's the South versus the rest of the country, that we are better athletes than all of them. And the only way they can win is if they bring the athletes from down here up there, black and white, by the way. Same thing with musicians, same thing with cooks, same things with the astronauts and folks that are leading historically Black colleges and universities. It just seems to me that so much potential has been wasted and so much has been lost. On top of that, it is 100% true that when you give folks where we live access to a great education, opportunity for jobs, if you give them the freedom that everybody deserves, people perform at the highest levels possible. And I just, yearn for the day. We're going to have to fight for it, because power is not going to cede this, where we're going to demand the idea that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. And so with E Pluribus Unum, my organization, we're trying to eat this elephant one bite at a time. We are trying to change the narrative by making sure that we tell our history, our whole history, and nothing but our full history, so people can understand, as Dr. Flint said, that in 1860, if 46% of people in Alabama were African American, the same as, it's not as high in Louisiana, but it's pretty true. And then shortly thereafter, when we began to go through Reconstruction, we had actually 2 African American governors in Louisiana. There were senators, there were congressmen, and of course, then we retrenched with the Black Code. And then on top of that, then the oppressive legislation started to come in. That was all designed to make it really, really hard for people of color to do well. All of those vestiges remain with us today. And so all of you, this is a CLE. You guys are learning the law, you're thinking through the law, the history of the law, why it was designed, understanding the difference between de facto and de jure. You can change the laws, but if you don't change the hearts, then that gets to be hard too. We have a lot of work ahead of us. At times when I get, a little bit down in the dumps, y'all can't see this, but the picture behind me is of me and John Lewis, who I'm sure he was everybody's hero on this call, but I knew the congressman. I knew him well, and I loved him. I had a picture of him behind my desk when I was the mayor, and every time I got scared, which was often, by the way, I turn around and I look at that picture, and I remember him with his trench coat, with his little backpack, fixing to take a whooping from the sheriff. And, he knew he was going to get hit, but he didn't move. And that always gave me tremendous courage to just kind of keep going. When you're going to lose friendships or people are going to get angry or frustrated with you, to just kind of stand up and stand in your strength. And don't wait, like Dr. Flint said, not that he did, he's being humble. He's always been a courageous soldier. You're a white guy in the South, and you talking against white people in the 50s and 60s, you losing all your friends all the time. And so he's being a little bit humble that it wasn't until later in his life. He's been a hero his whole life. And Dr. Flint, I appreciate your work. But you got to stand up to it, and you got to look in the face of it, and you have to speak truth to power. And as officers of the court, if you think about the great Thurgood Marshall, all the other great lawyers that went before, right now, Sherilyn Ifill, who's leading the Legal Defense Fund for the National Association for the NAACP, there are people out there that are fighting hard. Stacey Abrams is battling every day. We have a lot of allies together in the South that maybe we haven't been able to find each other yet, but we're starting to find each other now. And we're gonna pull it together, and we're gonna come up with thoughtful and systemic changes that are gonna change the trajectory of the country. But it requires us to really stand in our strength and stand in our purpose. And as lawyers, we have a very, very, very special role to play. I know the president of the United States right now, and thank God he's only going to be president for 50 more days, has twisted the law in a way that you never anticipated. And that's bad news. The good news is the institutions seem to be holding. The real challenge is that with so many new judges on the federal bench, the federal judiciary, which used to be the bastion of civil rights, may in fact turn into the protector of the status quo. And the only way you change that is by electing people to state legislatures and Congress that pass laws that are clear, that strict constructionists have to interpret the way they promised when they were sworn in. So we are at the dawn of a new level of legal engagement that is going to be wholly different from what happened back in the 50s and 60s when the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal, I don't know where Alabama is, but Louisiana, Mississippi, and the Fifth Circuit, you might be as well, when judges like John Minor Wisdom and Skelly Wright actually protected people's rights as opposed to maintain the status quo that oppressed them. Everybody on this call has an incredible and significant role to play going forward, because it's going to be a battle so that America can find herself again. And as President-elect Biden says, finding the soul of the nation, it's important to reflect on what that soul is. And I think true words were never spoken when it was said that where there is no justice, there is no peace. Because if we don't live in a just society, there's nothing but alienation. There's nothing but this distension and dissension. And that's not who we're supposed to be as Americans. But in order for us to get back to where we were, we're going to have to redesign it. And we're going to have to do it in an intentional and a purposeful way. It's going to be hard. But I actually, as sad as I am when I think about the Great Migration, I am really, really hopeful about the younger generation of leaders that I see coming forward who are really digging down deep and thinking about these kinds of systemic changes that will not just be good for African Americans, but be good for the nation as a whole. Because from my perspective, I think in this regard, although the founding fathers were not perfect, this notion that out of many that we are one, that diversity is a strength, not a weakness, that all people come to the table of democracy as equals, that's the right idea. We've never really gotten it right, but man, what would happen if we did? And I just dream a lot about what if we could get it right. And I think that even though it feels like we're really far apart, even though this last year has been as dark a year as any of us have ever had in our lives, although not the worst that the United States of America has had, but a fairly bad 12 months, not only around health, but around George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. Thinking all the way back, your mind doesn't have to take you too far to just remember that even back to Emmett Till and further back, as though somehow this has been going on forever, because it has. And I think the country's got to confront this issue. We have to decide that we want to go in a different direction. And we're the ones that are going to have to make it so. And so I'm committed to this work. I know that you guys are. There are a lot of really, really, really smart folks that have been thinking about this for a long time. And if we find each other, we ought to be able to design a pathway forward where we create a vision, design a strategy, make a plan, and then make it happen. So thank you for having me. I'm happy to answer any questions with the good doctor as we go forward. Thanks.
And thank you both. Thank you both. So I'm going to get us started with a couple of questions, just one or two that references some of the comments that you've made thus far, and also some material that you speak to, both of you, in your writings, in your books. And so what's very interesting, or of course it's going to come out here in your presentations, Dr. Flint, very early on, you referenced your conversion experience. And I love the way you phrase it. Your conversion experience as a teenager, coming to reconcile racism with the Bible. You both referenced this in different ways, where you've arrived, both of you have arrived at the same place, but by very different means, okay? And so my question specifically, is really, it's pointed out in Mayor Landrieu's book, referencing transformative awareness. You mentioned how one can become capable through difficulty, of course, of a sudden shift in the way we think about the past, but it requires acknowledgement that we've either been inattentive, insensitive, myopic, or hateful. Okay, this is a part of a direct quote from you, Mayor Landrieu. And so my question is, you know, Dr. Flint, but for both of you, you've experienced this transformative awareness, okay, without the guidance of family, because in Mayor Landrieu's book, he references the fact that he got there through the example of his family, whereas you did not. And so I'd like for both of you to answer the same question, because I think that how you arrived here is so different. Your responses will be different. What advice or what words of wisdom can you offer those who have no good example within their network of influence to arrive at this place? And so, Dr. Flint, I'd like to start with you because you volunteered this conversion experience. And so if you could take on the question first, and then Mayor Landrieu, you next.
That's a great question. I don't think there's any normative way in which people confront race. You may confront it in terms of a neighbor, or as was the case of one of my sons at Auburn High School, an African-American boy that you really liked, who defied all the stereotypes that the larger culture presented. You can also do it by education, reading, thinking. I especially found myself influenced by African-American fiction, and two of my favorite books of all time are Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. Zora Neale Hurston was born 15 miles from where I live in Notasulga, although she went to Florida and then to Harlem. But read Their Eyes Were Watching God if you want a good feminist African-American view of the world. And then Ralph Ellison, who was a student at Tuskegee University, 20 miles from where I taught at Auburn. Invisible Man, I still think, is one of the greatest arguments against the trade-offs that African Americans have had to make between economic prosperity, i.e. Tuskegee University and the crumbs that it got from white donors, versus the kind of culture that Booker T. Washington enforced at the university, having to live within the reality of what he experienced there. And Ellison's absolutely visceral attack in Invisible Man with the fictional Booker T. Washington that he presents. And then I might add one further step in that is the fierce attacks on Ralph Ellison by people like Richard Wright and Langston Hughes, who didn't consider him liberal enough or radical enough for the standards of the modern Black movement in Harlem. Also, I think it's really important to understand that for some of us, myself notably, the Bible can be a really radical book. Now, it can also be used to reinforce whatever prejudices and traditional culture you come from. But for me, it was a radical book. For me, the question of walking in the steps of Jesus, the first title of the Christian movement in the Roman Empire was Followers of the Way rather than Christianity. I like that. Because if you seriously read the Gospels, and if you say every day of your life, I'm going to follow in the steps of Jesus, you cannot wind up where most Southern Baptists are. They may say they follow the steps of Jesus. No, they follow Southern culture. They follow Southern traditional. They don't follow the steps of Jesus, because you can't wind up where most Alabama white people are. and follow the steps of Jesus. So for me, it was the Bible, which I still think is the most radical book I've ever read. For some, it's education. For some, it's culture. But as you point out, it's a complex way in which we get to where we are in life.
Thank you. Mayor Landrieu?
You made me laugh, Dr. Flint. Jesus was a radical dude. I mean, if it's funny, you think about it. We didn't come on here to preach, and I'm a broken man like everybody else. But Jesus was pretty radical. People got all upset about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, but Jesus was like, look, give the season what it's season. Guys, we're going to break this down. And I'm going to give you all a new way of doing stuff that doesn't make any sense to any of you. And if you think about it, this is why I completely agree with Dr. Flynn about the inability. And it's a real conundrum for white evangelicals and white Christians who are so racially challenged to somehow try to reconcile the very simple message of Jesus. Was it you have to love your neighbor as yourself? Just think about that thought for a second. And then you ask them, well, how is anything that we're doing consistent with that? It's very hard to answer. And without spending our lives talking about President Trump, many of the policies that he enacted that seem to be completely antithetical to what I consider to be just mainstream Christian thought were supported wholly by people that professed to be evangelical Christians. And certainly, I think it's fair to say the Southern Baptist culture, and in some instances, at least half the Catholics. I'll let the Methodists and the Protestants and the Presbyterians think themselves. But, when you think through that a little bit, it kind of makes the point that Dr. Flint's making, that this is cultural in many ways, that whiteness supersedes really everything. And I think that that's probably true. I've come to understand that this is a class issue and it is a cultural issue. But when you kind of peel it all back, just from my perspective, it's just my point, that race is right beneath the surface of everything. And the idea of whiteness is very challenging to white people when you begin to speak to them that way about it. So as a white Southerner, somebody who was called the blonde-haired, blue-eyed devil when I was about 18 in my life, it was the first time that I went like, wow, that person, called me white. I actually remember where I was when that happened. It's not that I didn't know I was white, but, when I talk to a lot of white people now, I try to help sensitize them to African Americans have been forced to wear their race their entire life. That's not something that white people have had to do because of their privilege. And they don't fully appreciate it. When you start talking to white people about institutional racism, as opposed to it being just one negative act against another person that doesn't look like you, they reject it because they are not thoughtful about it. And so when I wrote that in my book about, well, it could be intentional, it could be benign neglect, it could be ignorance, is because after I took the monuments down, I had gotten a lot of fights with a lot of people about it. And, when I started challenging them about why they supported the monuments, why would they fight so hard to keep a statue of Robert E. Lee up in the center of our city, a guy who never came to the city of New Orleans? Why was it so important to them? Some of them were agents, if you will, of the Daughters of the Confederacy, who were believers in this myth of the lost cause and were intentional in their hatred. A lot of people, some black, some white, were like, I didn't even know what those things were. Never thought much about them. That's the place where I went and watched the Mardi Gras parades with my daddy. So there was some, some of them were like, well, that's just a nice statue. Why do we have to take it down? And some people were like, we're not fans of Sam Cooke's song, Change is Gonna Come. They were like, we don't want to change anything no matter what. And so I found people in a bunch of different places for a bunch of different reasons. And not everybody that was opposed to taking them down were opposed for reasons that you would consider to be racist. Some of it was just ignorance. So as we now jump forward, that was 2016, 2018. We now in this moment of quote unquote another racial reckoning, with George Floyd's murder and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, et cetera. A lot of white people are starting to ask, man, what am I supposed to do? Well, I've heard from many people that, black people are saying, why do white people keep asking us what you're supposed to do? Well, do I really have to be the one that tell you what books to read? You got the internet. Why don't you go look yourself? And so when Dr. Flint was talking, he was talking about, Langston Hughes and Ellison and Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass. All of that's really great stuff. But there's a whole plethora of great new writings that are coming out and that have been with us for a long period of time that white people can go look for and look at, and then let them take you back to kind of more historical writings. Jimmy Baldwin is now Professor Eddie Glaude, who's writing a lot about the stuff that James Baldwin wrote. But back in the day, if you thought about Malcolm and Martin, Jimmy Baldwin was kind of around, but he wasn't as revered at the time as some other writers. But now all of a sudden he's being found again. And of course, what Dr. Flint was alluding to was in the African-American community, there, like in the white community, there is always discussion about, well, who's gone further, who's gone faster, who's not doing enough. We're having this argument right now as we speak about the term defund police. So the Black Lives Matter movement is saying that's an important phrase. That's the one we want to use. President Obama is saying, and James Clyburn is saying, well, don't use that. I mean, this has been a constant conflict. You saw this actually on the highway between Martin Luther King and well, he's too soft. He's not going far enough. Be that as it may, all of those arguments are on the same side of the divide. Those are arguments about process, arguments about strategy, arguments about structure, but not arguments about where we ought to be going, but how to get there and how we bring people along with us. I find white people to be very tender when you start talking to them about race. I observe that we're all terrible at it, that we haven't really thought about. We know how to advocate. Everybody knows how to advocate for their cause, but we don't. This notion of how do you get somebody to transform? I mean, what's actually the process that you do it, other than having a conversion like Dr. Flint and I have been talking about, where people have a religious experience because they've read the text and it finally has touched them in a special way. How do you get the entire country to actually go, man, you know what? We got it wrong. And I would just offer this to everybody that's listening. The most powerful 6 words in the English language, the hardest ones to say and the hardest ones to get to, you already know what they are. The first 3 are, I am sorry. And the next 3 are, I forgive you. Now, there could be, I don't know, Doc, you could talk to me about this. The distance between the I'm sorry, first of all, getting somebody to acknowledge that there was a wrong and that you had a role in it, or that you had a responsibility for it, and allowing the words I am sorry to come out of your personal mouth or collectively is a challenge. That takes a long time. And then the distance between getting the and I forgive you could be, well, I can't say I forgive you just because you said you're sorry. There has to be some kind of compensation, compensatory something. There's got to be some penance. That could take a year. It could take a moment. It could take 50 years. And then to the I forgive you so that we can get past it. That idea for our country, I think, to have a national reckoning, a national reconciliation so that we can finally have a communion and finally have what it is that we said we wanted, which is out of many one, I think is a mouthful for us. And I think that we are in our infancy. I think notwithstanding the fact that, I'm 60 years old and Dr. Flint's a bit older than me, he will recognize to you that this is a very young country. But I don't think democracy will survive just because. I think we have to make it into what it is, which is why I believe that we have to reclaim the flag, and we have to reclaim what patriotism really is. And patriotism is criticizing your country, as Jimmy Baldwin said, precisely because you love it. That is why you criticize. America. That is why dissent is important. That is why the founding fathers wrote it in there, because they knew that we could not survive if we didn't have the freedom to redress our grievances against the government. And a real patriot is a patriot who stands up and speaks truth to power. That's what a real patriot is. And that phrase has been taken away from us. And I think that we have to aggressively and overtly reclaim it. And we have to reclaim it particularly by speaking truth to power and demanding that the country change or not go forward. Put it simply, we're all either going forward together or we're not going forward at all. And I kind of think we're at that point where we have to call the question in this country and stand up, for the issues that are important.
Again, I'd like to point out that the two of you continue, as is very much represented in your writings, to arrive at the same place by very different means. So I'd like to point it out again, starting with a quote from Dr. Flint and you, Mayor Landrieu, and I'd like for you to start first with responding, and then we'll have Dr. Flint's response. And so this is in reference to white self-interest, okay? And so in Dr. Flint, in your book, Poor But Proud, you're referencing the experience of poor whites in Alabama. And this may not be a direct quote, but essentially you say that, at one time, more than half of Alabama's Caucasian population was living in substandard housing, earning a salary that was inadequate for proper clothing and health. They were subject to widespread illness. And so you ask the question, though, what prevented such people from recognizing the commonality of their grievances with those of poor Blacks? And you say that, why did racial caste loom so much larger than economic class? And so similarly, Mayor Landrieu, you mentioned that race is the thing that brings together working class whites with country club conservatives who have united against Blacks despite the fact that there is little other than their racism that they have in common.
Yeah.
So again, the two of you have touched on this very well in your writing. So if you could speak, starting with you, Mayor Landrieu, about why you think that is. And I want us to dig deep about why we think that exists, because essentially we're talking about a whole group of people who, in a sense, in a way, act against their own self-interest for the sake of furthering racism.
Well, I'm not a social psychiatrist, nor am I a social anthropologist. I can only observe what it is that my eyes and my ears and my experience tell me. I don't have to understand what I'm looking at, but I have come to conclude that is the power and the sickness of racism, that white people will vote against their own economic self-interest because somebody has convinced them that if they don't do that, they're going to be worse off than better off. I happen to just believe from my own life experience that is not only is that terrible, it's just completely wrong. I don't want to boil this down to an economic argument, because the justice of it is what really drives what we ought to do. But if someone wanted to talk to you and challenge the theory that, no, I don't want to hang out with poor Black people because I know I'm a poor white guy, but I got a better chance of being a rich guy, than being a rich Black person, you would say to them, do you know what the loss, the economic loss is that we've suffered in the United States of America, especially in the South, of Black people and white people, because we can't work together? I mean, you could actually count it if you wanted to make an economic argument. It's not the only argument to be made. I think that there are a lot of economists that can prove without fear of equivocation that the kinds of things that bring people together are better for everybody. Medicaid expansion, for example, which I don't think that y'all have in Alabama. I'm not sure. We have it in Louisiana. I don't think they have it in Georgia. Access to just healthcare, so people can have the freedom to get to work, not to have to go triage in the public health emergency room if your kid has an earache for 13 hours and then lose your job. The penal system that is completely and totally upside down. It's funny, Dr. Flint, you talk was so good. I keep referring to it when all of a sudden the migration's happening and then white people start thinking that we're losing, some sense of labor. Now we have to change our policy. That's when they started thinking, oh, wait, this doesn't make sense for us either. But I think that you have demagogues like George Wallace and Jimmy Davis and now Donald Trump, David Duke, who will scare the hell out of white people in a way that will force them to vote against their own economic interest. And for the life of me, I don't understand why it is. I do think that I have enough hope and belief that if we can get people to understand our history, understand the narrative, start changing the narrative, that is telling stories that are true stories, real stories. By the way, not unlike the one that Tony Blinken, who Joe Biden just appointed to be Secretary of State, told about his grandfather who was saved by a battalion of African-American soldiers in Germany and saved him. The story of those guys, they actually were trained in Louisiana and they were abused when they were here. And so in that story, I wish I had a link to it, Tony Blinken says how ironic it is that my great-grandfather was saved, right? And his freedom was preserved by African-American soldiers who weren't enjoying freedom back home. You think about Muhammad Ali when he was Cassius Clay, when he won the Olympics, coming back and not being able to get into a restaurant in Kentucky. Just think about that for a minute and think about how self-defeating that is for us and how much we've lost. It really would break you down. The only thing that gives you hope is we have to believe that we can change, and we have to believe that we can penetrate people's minds by educating them better and training them well. And I'll end with this. South Pacific was a musical that was written by Rodgers and Hammerstein. There's a song in it. It's a famous song called You Have to Be Carefully Taught. The words, you may not have ever heard the song, but they'll be familiar to you. So you have to be taught to hate and fear. You have to be taught from year to year. It has to be drummed in your dear little ear. You have to be carefully taught. You have to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. And that is the essential truth, that racism and hatred is taught. It's brought down from generation to generation, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. And if you want to change it, you have to teach people a different way. That's the pathway to a better tomorrow.
Thank you. Dr. Flint?
I still like teaching history by story, Adrian, so I'll tell you a story. Several years ago, more than that, about 15 years ago, I had a couple come to my Sunday school class. I teach a Sunday school class at Auburn First Baptist Church, and I have 120 members in it. So it's a very large class. And we have a big sign on the wall, and it says, "We reserve the right to love anyone," reversing the classic racist motto, "We reserve the right to serve anyone." And I had a couple come in. He was an African-American from Hartselle, the first African-American and the first athlete at Rhodes College, which used to be Presbyterian College in Memphis, Tennessee. He was a multi-sport athlete from Hartselle, football, golf. When he graduated from there, he went to the University of Akron and became academic advisor at the University of Akron. And then when Bill Muse came as president at Auburn from Akron, he brought my friend to Auburn, and he became the academic advisor for the entire sports program, the vice president at Auburn. And we had one of the highest rates of athletes graduate with baccalaureate degrees when Virgil was athletic director of any place, any university in America. So they show up in my class. She breaks into tears when she comes to the door. And I thought, good Lord, I haven't even started teaching the class and she's already unhappy with what I'm saying and is weeping. So I after class, I said, "I'm sorry if I said something that offended you." She said, "Oh no." She said, "I've never been to the South before. And I was so terrified of going to a Baptist church in Alabama that when I saw your sign about you reserving the right to love anybody, and I felt so at home. And I had Nigerian members and African-American members and so forth. Well, to make a long story short, Virgil tragically died of a heart attack when he was 48. And so his three daughters became our goddaughters. They wanted us to be their sort of surrogate father. And I watched them grow up. These three Auburn daughters, one of them was the first African-American ever pledged to her sorority at Auburn. Another one is the academic recruiter for Occidental College in Pasadena, California, covering the entire South, recruiting students for Occidental College, which must not be hard. If you're recruiting Black students to go to Pasadena, California, I wouldn't think that'd be a great problem. A second daughter has a medical degree from a university, a medical college in Philadelphia. And she spent the last year basically in the hospital the whole time, not able to come home because of the COVID virus as a doctor. The youngest one graduated magna cum laude from Auburn last year in software design engineering and is a software designer for Exxon Corporation in Houston, Texas. And I'm thinking, if every white Southerner could know my three goddaughters, or their father, or their mother, all of a sudden the institutional racism of America, because racism is basically an institutional structure. Once you get to know individual Black people, I would defy any white racist, even George Wallace, to dislike people like Virgil Starks, Donna Starks, Victoria Starks, Carolyn Starks, Anastasia Starks. And so, you know, I kind of wish in a way, as I told a reporter for the Financial Times of London, when he interviewed me about this, I said, if I had my way, I would close down every white evangelical church in America for a year and force them to spend the entire year when they would have been in church reading the four gospels over and over and over and over again without any institutional connection or influence whatsoever. Nothing but the four gospels. Just read them for a year and get to know some Black people, and I will guarantee you we will solve this problem.
Thank you. Thank you both. All right. And so we'll start with our questions from our audience. The first question is to Dr. Flint's point. How do we encourage and even reward major corporations and other moneyed entities to give back to the undervalued and exploited communities from which the foundations of that wealth originated?
Well, I can give you a case study. The Business Council of Alabama, which you know well in Birmingham, it is the Fortune 500, Fortune 300 companies. It's Alabama Power Company. It's Royal Cup Coffee Company. It's Vulcan Materials Company, companies like that all over the state of Alabama. The Business Council of Alabama worked with me on educational reform, and in the equity funding lawsuit, as you may remember, I was the facilitator for the conversation about equity funding of public schools in Alabama. And Mitch, the argument here is pretty simple. We have the lowest property taxes in the United States. We fund education with sales taxes mainly. In sales taxes, if you're an African-American and you work as a janitor and you make $10,000 a year, you pay 10% of your income for groceries, just like I do with an income 10 times what your income is. We consider that to be fair because everybody pays the same tax. And so the Business Council of Alabama said, if we're ever going to have decent schools, without which we're not going to have sustainable prosperity, we're going to have to increase the budget for public education enormously. Not only that, but we have to recognize that Hoover, Alabama in Shelby County, which has some of the best schools in Alabama. Well, that's because they have the Galleria, which is the largest mall in Alabama. which receives more sales taxes than any other place in Alabama, which funds better schools than other places in Alabama. And so the problem is, if you don't have a Galleria, and none of the Black Belt counties do, they don't even have shopping centers anymore in the Black Belt. How are you going to do this? And so our answer was equity funding. You transfer wealth from places that have it to places that don't have it, so that everybody can get a decent education and you don't leave any children behind. That was our idea. Where it fell apart, Adrian, was I was the one designated to go to talk to Joe Reed, whom you know as the head of the Alabama Democratic Council, and Paul Hubbard, the head of AEA, the co-directors of AEA, when the Black and white educational groups were merged. And this was the deal I said. I said the Business Council of Alabama is willing to spend $1 billion. They'll back $1 billion a year increase in property taxes, and they have the power to pass this in the legislature if you will release AEA delegates in the House of Representatives. But they want accountability provisions that go with this. For instance, it shouldn't cost you $55,000 in legal fees to transfer a sexual predator teacher to another, to get him out or her out of the classroom. That's stupid. Multiple layers of appeal to get a sexual predator out of a school system is not going to be something they're going to support. So Paul deferred to Joe, and Joe said, you can forget that. We're not releasing any of the steps necessary to fire a teacher who's incompetent or moral turpitude in Alabama. So what I did is go back to the Business Council of Alabama, and I said, you know, they're not going to bend at all on accountability issues of any kind. Performance, teachers, having a major in the field you teach, none of that they're going to bend on. You know what they told me? They said they may not think they're going to bend on that, but we're going to raise enough money to destroy Paul Hubbard's control of the House of Representatives and elect an all-Republican legislature and a Republican governor, and then we'll see what happens. And that's exactly what they did, just exactly what they did. That's called power politics. Yep. And that's what made the Alabama legislature Republican and what elected Republican governors. So that's the reason I'm saying that until we find ways to think beyond the groups we represent, beyond the institutions we come from, toward a sense of justice, to use Mitch's term, until we have a sense that justice is the issue we seek and not what serves Democrats, not serves Republicans, not serves liberals, not serve conservatives, but serve the human rights of the people of Alabama, we're going to be stuck right where we are, and so is the South.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is, and the writer acknowledges this is a difficult question. She says, one difficult question white people need to ask themselves is, what does it mean to be white? In that answer, they will find the how in dismantling the racist caste system in America. So it ends.
That's not a difficult question.
No, well, it ends with the question. Okay, the question is, how do the panelists define what it means to be white? And Mitch, I'm gonna let you answer first.
Yeah, well, I shouldn't have talked first. I didn't know there was a question after the question. I'll tell you a story. As a professor, like I said, my team was traveling throughout the South. We were in, right where Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi meet, up in that region. And there's a little town up there. There's Indianola, there's Tallulah, et cetera, et cetera. And we had just had a meeting with some folks from the community. There was an older gentleman, African-American. He had been a council member at large forever, well-recognized leader in the community. And then there was a white lady. I'm just going to describe her. She had platinum blonde hair. She had white pearls on, a really nice baby blue blouse. She had nice jewelry on. I deduced from that she had some money in her pocket. In that conversation, the African-American leader, when I asked him, I said, hey, the white people and the black people, how y'all get along here? And she said, well, we get along great. I said, where the white people live? And she said, over there where the nice houses are. And I said, where the black people live? And he said, and before he even finished I said, you don't have to finish. I know it's always across the railroad tracks or the river or the lake. He said, yeah. I said, well, how y'all doing together? He said, my son, he said, we have reached a place of peaceful segregation in this community. And I said, wait, what? I've never heard that before. I said, say that to me again. He said, peaceful segregation. So I said, all right. I said, I'm going to come back and talk to you in a little while, but we walked outside for a minute and the young lady was outside. I said, ma'am, can I talk to you for a second? I said, how's that conversation in there going? She goes, what's a little uneasy? I said, well, can I ask you a question? She said, sure. I said, do you think you benefit from white privilege? I could have just as soon said something really nasty to her because she looked like she was about to have a heart attack. And she said, I certainly do not. And I said, well, let me ask you a little bit more about that. I said, you got any kids? She said, yeah. I said, a teenager? She goes, surely. And I said, well, what would happen if you and your husband went out to eat one night and you left your kid at home and he had some friends over and they smoked a little weed? I'm not saying your kid's a bad kid, but I'm just saying if you got out the way a little bit, smoked a little weed, they were having a party, lots of noise, and the police came, what would happen? She said, well, Irving, who was the police chief, and she knew his first name, she said, Irving would call me and I said, and I bet you he would hand your kid over to her and say, I'm gonna let your mama take care of your business. Isn't that what would happen? She goes, oh, absolutely. And I said, well, remember that guy in there said the black people live across the lake? What would happen if his son, who was a teenager, was smoking weed and they were having a party and they were out of the way? What would Irving do to them? And she goes, oh, well, I think he would take them to jail. I said, you understand about how you got the benefit of the doubt because you knew the police chief and they didn't? Do you understand that? And she said, well, now that you pointed out to me, well, the answer is that's what being white is like. And when you talk to white people like this, they start to acknowledge very begrudgingly that the color of their skin gives them the benefit of the doubt. But you have to almost point it out in chapter and verse, but it's aggravating because it's so obvious that people need to work harder to do it. They need to work harder at this, but they can only do it if they will only do it if they feel like at some point in time they're going to be helped by that rather than hurt by that. So I believe it is a matter of justice. I observe for other people, though, that it is a matter of perceived self-interest. They somehow think, and by the way, I think that this is universally true. I can talk like this because I have Italian heritage, and on my wife's side they got Irish. But back in the day when the Irish came over here and the Italians, and they were at the lowest rung of the totem pole, they had to figure out where they were going to go and who they were going to be with. You kind of have the same issue percolating, with this assumption that because we have brown people and black people, that somehow when we become a majority minority country, that everybody's going to hang together. That has not been universally true. It's usually been true that people try to go up the economic ladder and they try to code switch and they, try to pass, as we would say in Louisiana, pass ball, because you get treated better. And that has always been kind of a way for people to hide and never really confront the issue. This is going to come to a head in our country. It's coming now. It's coming ferociously. But in the year 2040, when America is majority minority, it's going to be very challenging. It's going to be very challenging for corporations. If they're smart, which they should be, it really shouldn't be much of a challenge. We should actually think to ourselves now, how do we want to look? How do we want to open up? How are we going to prosper? We can only prosper if we do it together. Every company I know, every organization I know, every Mardi Gras crew I know, every sports crew I know that wants to be just male and white is going to atrophy. That's just what's going to happen. It's just going to atrophy. It's going to isolate, and it's going to get to be less. And when people start to connect their personal self-interest with some sense of justice that might be tweaking them, on the right shoulder, on the left shoulder, they're going to begin to understand this a little bit more. Now, let me end with this. The scary part of it is that you're feeling the clawback that's being given oxygen by Donald Trump, who's feeding the Proud Boys and who's feeding this white nationalist thing. That has to be put down. But African Americans are justified in saying to white people like me, hey man, this is y'all's problem. And it's y'all's problem because y'all control everything. You control the White House, you control the Senate, you control Congress, you control the Supreme Court, you control all the major businesses, you control the Federal Reserve, you control the state legislature. So why do you keep looking at me to help solve this problem? I can't solve it. You're the one who has the power. You have to solve it, and you have to solve it for the right reason. And then you're on mute.
Thank you. Because we're at time, I'm going to leave off with this very last question before turning it back over to our organizers. Mayor Landrieu, the people want to know if you're running for Congress.
No, I am not. Thank you for asking. You know, that was good. They did a poll and I came out first in the poll. I was feeling good because I thought people forgot who I was. So I felt good about that. But no, I'm not running. But thanks for asking.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our presenters. At this time, we are out of time, and I ask that the attendees who want CLE credit will stay connected just for a moment for instructions on how to obtain your CLE certification. I will now turn you over to our organizers and our producers. Thank you all.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. We really enjoyed the panel today. Great discussions, great moderation. Everything was awesome. This is a great way for us to end this CLE series with the information that's been brought forward, the perspective and insight and everything that you all gave us today. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank everyone for attending as well. I've already put into the comments the link to the feedback. However, we will also send out an email afterwards. Be sure that you complete that feedback so that we can submit your name for credit with the state bar, or so that we can send you a certificate to attest to your attendance so that you can submit it to your own state bar if you're seeking to get CLE credit. Once again, thank you all for being here. Thanks to all the panelists, for everyone attended, and also a special thanks to Judge Katrina Ross and Judge Tracy Todd, who worked magnificently with the Judicial Council this year, and of course, under the leadership of Agnes Chappelle, who is the chair of the Judicial Council. So once again, thanks everyone for being here. Hope you have a great rest of the day.